Hey everybody, welcome to this course. This is the ultimate course for N8N. My name is David Soden. I'll be an instructor for the remainder of the series. This will also be the only time that I'll be going on camera, and the reason for that is because video can be a distraction, not only for myself, but for you guys watching, because then you've got the instructor on the screen, you got to move it around, it takes longer to edit it. I'm mainly focused on giving you the best course for N8N. So for the remainder of this video, I'm going to go off camera, but in any event, I do want to start off the course with a little bit of an introduction. I've already explained my name, and again, David Soden. I'll be your course instructor again, and the concepts that I'll be teaching you here today follows along what I've been doing for the last 15 plus years. This is around low code and no code, and so N8N is a great tool within that. We'll get into what N8N is and isn't and everything else. But suffice to say, I've done a lot of stuff on OutSystems, on the Power Platform, you name it, Google App Sheets, anything that's low code, no code, I've touched it in some way, shape, form, or fashion, and mainly from just trying to do a competitive analysis as well as teach people on it. My specialty is in the Microsoft Power Platform, and obviously now N8N. We'll get into what N8N is and isn't and what you should be using it for. I've talked to some folks at N8N, and so if you go to their website, they're very specifically, heavily focused in the IT trench or geeky propeller heads like myself that know a lot about it. But I wanted to convey to you so that you can convey to your senior leadership and management how powerful and how great N8N is so that you can communicate to the business the benefits of what you can do with N8N. All right, so we're going to cover all of the nodes. I'm not going to go into super deep detail, but I am going to try to cover at least why you would want to use it. We're going to show you how to connect it to different areas. And this is what's different than whatever else is out there because they're all focused on specific solutions or specific pieces. And so you're relying on other people's creativity in these templates to come up with solutions. I want you to know the nuts and the bolts. I want you to know the Lego pieces because I want to inspire your creativity to build something excellent and great. And that really is the differentiation between my course and many other courses. I want to get into all of the details of that. Okay, and this is really about the user experience, not only you, the user, but also the things that you create for your business, for your company, for your customers, right? And so to do that, we need to get into the weeds with N8N administration. I want to get into the SQL Server or the Postgres, depending on what it is that you're using, to be able to get information out of it because, garbage in, garbage out. Or if you don't know how to get something in, or rather out of what you put in, then there's a lot of details and every information, not every information, but most information then is lost or trapped inside the system. I want to show you how to get to all of that. All right, well, that's it for this brief introduction. Let's get into the course, and we'll start with a general high-level low-code, no-code overview, because some of you coming to this course may or may not know anything about low-code, no-code. So we'll try to give you a little bit of preparation. For those of you already seasoned, skip this section. Maybe just visit the last portion of that course, which is on JSON, because N8N is very, very heavily reliant on JSON. So if you're not too familiar with that, then make sure to do it. Otherwise, if you know JSON, skip over that. Anyway, we'll see you in the next video. So variables, I want you to think of a box, okay? And in a box, you can put anything in the box. A box can hold something else, essentially, okay? Instead of thinking of a box, you can think of buckets or containers. Bottom line is these are things that hold other things, okay? Now, when we start talking about this in context to computers and how they work, it's essentially a slice of memory that you're carving out, and that's what you're calling the box or container. And then we're going to assign something human readable or that's understandable, and we're going to give it a name. So imagine if you were to go into your computer with a tiny little microscope and slice out a little piece, and then you assign a label or a name to that little piece that you sliced out. That's your box or your container. Now, variables hold values of a specific data type. Now, that's why we started with data types, because it builds on this right here. And so sometimes your box can hold data of one particular type, meaning all text or all numbers, integers, all floats, all whatever, okay? And then other times they can hold values that are simply just what's considered a mixed type. And because of that, different programming languages are easier than others. There's debates amongst programmers about which one's better. That's not what we're going to get into here, but just know that's kind of the history, and kind of when you start dancing in this area, you're going to start to encounter these types of discussions, especially, God forbid, if you go on some of these forums, you'll see some really spirited debates on different paradigms and points of views. Okay, so variables are configured with one of two things, okay? So remember I told you we just give it a label or a name. That's the name of the box, right? I also want you to think of this as key. Now, what I am doing when I say this, I'm going to jump ahead and give you a little reasoning to my method or madness here, is that when we talk about JSON, I'm going to drop these little primers here so that it's a much easier jump for you to make in your mind's eye when we get there. Okay, so the box, the container, the variable, it's a name, but it's also called a key. So just remember the name of the box or the key is the key name. Think of maybe it that way. Okay, now the value is what's inside of the box. So again, name, value, key, value. I want you to kind of keep that in your head, okay? So here's an example. It's my variable, and then we have equals 3. Now notice that the data type is numeric in this example, right? And so this is what it might look like in JSON as a key value, okay? So one's more very plain English, but the other one's maybe a little harder to understand because you got some mustache or curly braces, and then you got some quotes, and then this little colon, and just the plain English version of how this breaks down is very simple. Your keys always go inside of quotes. Your value, in this case, it's a number 3. I'll show you what this looks like differently in just a second. And instead of using an equal sign, we're just going to use the colon. When you were back in school, remember ratios 1 to 1, 1 to 2? Anyway, that colon there is simply just in lieu of an equal sign. All right, now here's the same example, but this is a string. And the key difference here is notice that the 3 has quotes around it. So the takeaway here is, and if you can remember this, you'll be so much better than anybody else watching this video because, this is where programmers, when they're just starting, they start to, they get really hung up on data types, and this is where 90% of their bugs come from. Wrong data type, not casting properly. Anyway, so quotes, inside of the quotes means a string, or they call it a string literal. And this is what it might look like in JSON. Now, in JSON, notice that not only is the key does it have quotes around it, but also the value has quotes around it because, again, the value, if it has quotes, it's a string. Okay, here's a third variation of it. This is my variable equals true. Now notice that my variable in this example is kind of just a plain English way of saying it, but if we look at the JSON variation of this, notice that the word true doesn't have any quotes around it. And so there's your indication that when you see text with no quotes like this, especially something that's representative in your mind's eye like a light switch, something can either be on or off. This could be yes or no or true or false. It gets real sticky in a gray area though when you start dealing with zeros and ones. Okay, so this is where commenting your code will be paramount for you and others so that you understand the intention of how that might be used. Otherwise, you could accidentally mistake it for a number. Okay, so anyway, that's it for this section here. So next we're going to get into some very basic functions and just kind of show you what that might look like. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back. Now we're going to start with data types, and data types are the foundations from which all things that you are going to do in both programming as well as low code, no code, including н8н, it is a good understanding to make sure that you have at least a foundational understanding of data types. Okay, so we're going to start off with the most simplest one because we see this and use this every day, whether we realize it or not, whether we're typing an email, going on the internet, we're typing things on our keyboard, and that is just a bunch of text that we're typing. Now, it's important to understand what a character or what text is because in terms of, geeky programming type stuff, it has a special meaning. So these are characters and symbols. This is what it means to have a text. Okay, so this is the letter A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, there are numbers. And numbers, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but numbers are treated differently, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then there's symbols, like the hashtag, or the symbol, %, caret, star, asterisk, whatever you want to call it. And so all of these characters, numbers, and symbols are all considered text when we're talking about the data type of text. Now, there's a special thing that happens when you classify a number not as text, but literally as a number. And the difference is that you can do mathematical operations on it. If you have the number 1 plus 1, you're going to get 2. But if you try to add the text, the character 1, even though it is a number, to another text character 1, you're going to basically get an error because it doesn't know how to do math on characters. Because 1, yes, it's a number, it's just a string or a character. Now, other types of numbers that you have are these things called floats and decimals, and we see this with money all the time. You got, things like pi, 3.145, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so you've got all of those as well. And these are usually used in financial or mathematical or scientific calculations and things of that nature. The last one to understand, and this one sounds funny for most that are not coming from a programming background, but just think of this as a light switch, okay? It's either on or it's off. And so they come in a couple of different varieties depending on what it is that you're using as a programming language. They're either true or false, or 1 or 0, where 1 is true or on, and 0 is off. And then you have yes and no, and there's all different types of things. This is what it means to be binary or Boolean, okay? And so it's just a bit, and a bit is a 0 or a 1. It's either on or it's off, okay? So again, think of Boolean like a light switch. All right, and then finally, we're going to get to date and time. Now, date and time, hopefully self-explanatory, but I do want to preface to say that some programming languages have time as a separate function, some of them have date as a separate function, and some of them don't do any of them other than just combine them together and call date time. And you're going to see how н8н handles this and all of the different operational, things that you can potentially do there. All right, that's it for this one. This is the foundation because now we're going to talk about variables in the next video, and this is going to be so much clearer when we get into that portion. We'll see you in the next video. The understanding of conditions. Now, honestly, this is probably one of the easiest things to understand because it follows the human thought pattern of what you do and what we do as humans every single day. So let's take an example of what this might, or let's look at an example of what this might be. So if this, do that. So apply this to your life. If your dog, let's just say you're a dog lover, if your dog comes to you and begs you or scratches at the door, then open the door and let him go to the bathroom, right? So it's pretty much as simple as that. Now, if the dog were to do something else different, like wine over the food bowl, maybe he wants some water or maybe wants something to eat, right? So these are all of these conditions as it relates to your pet. And so it's the same thing in programming. Let's take an example of what this might be. And so we already showed, if this, then do that, or when this, then do that. Same type of thing. Let's look at a real programmatic example of how you might use н8н or a computer, not your pet. Okay, so here's an email value, Raj at gmail.com. Okay, and so the condition might be if the email contains the word Gmail, which in that case, we're assuming that it is a Gmail address. And you could actually, instead of just saying contains the word Gmail, a better use case would be at Gmail. That way you're getting an email address. You could show an alert or an error to the user to use a real company name. So this is what it might look like. And again, notice the quotes. If email value contains Gmail, show an alert. Please use a company email address. Otherwise, don't do anything. Just go ahead and accept and continue. Now, this doesn't account for issues coming up like Yahoo or any of these other mails that are not business email addresses, but this is one use case of this, okay? So this is all that this is. I just want you to understand what conditions are. It's essentially just if this, do that. And there's some other ways of handling it in н8н with a switch statement. And so this is just like the if this, then do that. It's just a different mechanism to account for what I had just mentioned. This is only Gmail, but what if it's Yahoo? And that's what a switch statement will be. If any one of these conditions are true, you can do that. And it can get a little bit gnarly where you have the if statement written out, because ifs are generally made in such a way to where if this is true, do this. If this is false, in this example, I said do nothing, but you could take another type of action. And in the other type of action, you can nest a second if, and you can chain this all the way to infinity, which gets very chaotic, very ugly in code, very hard to manage. And that's where the switch statement comes in. Got really far ahead of myself, unfortunately. Didn't mean to scare you there, but there are good, interesting, and good, easy to use cases. It sounds hard to understand, but when we get into н8н and I show you the switch and the if nodes, this will make much more sense and give you a sigh of relief. Even though it sounds complicated here in the real world, and н8н makes a breeze of it for you, so don't worry. We'll check all of that out when we get there. Okay, we'll see you in the next video. All right, everybody, buckle up again for this part of the video series as we get into this preparatory work. This is probably one of the more intense topics to talk about just because there's so much content to understand and learn and make sure that at least you're up to speed, okay? So this will be like drinking from the fire hose a little bit. Pause, rewind, and rewatch this video as many times as needed. This is only applicable to those that are brand new. If you just need a refresher, this is pretty straightforward. But wrapping your head around this concept is absolutely critical to understanding data structures and how to deal with data coming in and out of н8н nodes. All right, so collections, arrays, and dictionaries. They're all pretty much similar, but very different at the same time. I just want you to think of very specific use cases, and we'll go through all the examples here. All right, so these are nothing more than just a bunch of non-persistent lists. Typically, you do something in memory. Let's just say you get information from a database or a spreadsheet, you manipulate it, you do it as you're looping through it, blah, blah, blah. As all of this temporary stuff is happening in this non-persistent state in memory or the ephemeral storage, it is essentially just dealing with this all in the computer's memory in real time, okay? These are temporary lists, and they're used to process items. We've talked about all this stuff before up until this point, and you've seen that when we did looping and iterations. We processed this list of items, we did an action, and then of course you can run comparison or track changes. And in one of the examples we gave, we simply just did some data splitting and some data manipulation to update our database to make it maybe a little bit easier to use that data down this road for different use cases for whatever that might be. Okay, the other way you can use it is to package information and prepare it. Again, you've seen all of that. The other thing is important to understand is transporting information. Now in the next section, we're going to get into some JSON, and the way that the internet talks is with APIs, application programming interfaces. And to do that, you have to transport data. And to do that, you're typically going to have to put it in JSON, and JSON is a form of collections, arrays, dictionaries, blah, 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 and so on. So as we move into this, let's talk a little bit about collections and some of the characteristics. So collections, I want you to think of tables, okay? Now tables have rows and they also have columns. So think of the spreadsheet, okay? And spreadsheets can have one or more columns in them. They can also have one or more rows, and you'll also hear a row referred to as a record. So that's important to remember. And this is an example of a table and what this might look like in Excel. So you can see we have a table. That's the whole thing. We have 3 columns: full name, first name, second name. Like, remember we saw this before when we did the splitting. And so it's the same table, except now it's been fleshed out, it's been completed, the operation's done, and we have a full table with a bunch of data. And we again have 5 records or rows in this particular table. Okay, arrays are usually just a list. This is harder to describe and understand than what it actually and really is. Okay, so I'll try to simplify as much as I can. So arrays typically and almost always have a single column. Okay, so I'm gonna go back a little bit in the presentation, that table right there, that is what's referred to as a multi-dimensional array. If I had no columns of first name and second name, if you just deleted them off the screen and all we had was a list of full names, that is a single dimension, or that is just an array, a list of items, a list of full names. Otherwise, in its current state, it's multi-dimensional, meaning that it has more than one list or multiple lists within inside of the array, okay? And so that's what that means, unless multi-dimensional, okay? Hopefully that makes clear sense with your mind's eye by having a visual. Okay, they also can have one or more records. Now, it doesn't make much of a list if you have a list with one row, but technically speaking, it could still be an array with a single item. Okay, now arrays are indexed. This won't necessarily come up in N8N, but it is good programming understanding just in case you run against something outside of N8N that is going to be using these zero-based indexes. You can also think of this as records coming back from an API where you're having to deal specifically with the first item in an array or a list. So this is where this is going to come into handy itself. So pay attention. Now, that list, that table of full names where we had the first name, last name that I just showed a little while ago, this is where things get confusing for new beginners. The first row, the first record in that table is not row number 1, it's row number 0. And it sounds stupid, but just accept it for what it is. All things start at 0, not at 1. So we deal with arrays as index 0, which is row number 1, then index 1 is row number 2. So just think of whatever the index is, add 1 to it for what the row number actually is. So if it's index 0 and you add 1, it's row number 1. If you have index of 3, add 1 to it, it's row number 4. Okay, so maybe that'll help clarify that or make it clear in your mind's eye. Again, not important until you get into the specifics of it, because what'll happen is if you don't have that understanding, you're going to get back a row of data, or you're going to get back some data that you weren't expecting, and it's because you named the wrong index, expecting shifting by 1 plus or minus, depending on what it is you're doing, you're going to get that wrong row. But just that comes from this arrays are zero-based indexed. Okay, I've already gone through all of this here. This is a visual for that. Okay, so here we have a list of vehicles and car, boat, truck, plane, tractor. Okay, each item in the list. You're seeing it horizontally. Normally lists are vertical, top to bottom. So just this is a different way of looking at it, but just understand if you had a list from a drop down in a user interface, then you'd have car, boat, truck, blah, 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 top to bottom. And then index 0 is row 1. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself endlessly for no reason on that area. All right, let's talk about dictionaries, because dictionaries are a little bit different. They're also lists as well. And I want you to go back to that key value, because again, we're getting into JSON in the next area, and this is the primer for that, because in Python, dictionaries are used quite a bit, and as you get into JSON, dictionaries are also used, so this is very important. So the curly braces are very significant, and what this means is the key is the name, okay? So in case you forgot, in the very beginning of the series, we talked about variables. Well, here we are again, repeating ourselves one more time, and so this is some examples of what dictionaries look like. So here, in the first example, you have first name, and then you have David, okay? David is in quotes. Earlier, I gave you an example of a number, of a character in quotes. I forget what number it was, but in any event, if it doesn't have quotes, it's just a number. But here we're just using strings and text. And then we have a second iteration or a second version of this record. So if we look at the second example, we have first name, David, comma. Now, I highlighted the mustache braces or curly braces in yellow for the second example, because I wanted to give you an example that you would think that a first name and a last name is one record, right? Because or one row in a database. But the way that this nomenclature and symbolism is done here is that those brackets indicate there's 2 rows. You will see stuff like this in databases that are like Cassandra, or what they refer to as NoSQL. This is data structures in databases that don't follow normal spreadsheet tables and relations and things of that nature. So it is normal to see this way. This is going into these in-memory or even permanent or non-permanent structures. But the point here is, or the bottom line takeaway is, we have 2 different records, both with different column names in the second example. Just take it at face value. Don't worry about it. You'll have a specific, maybe you'll run into a specific use case where this happens in the real world, but we're not going to worry about it for this course. The most common use case is going to be the third and final example, where I have it completed as a single row in a database. Notice we only have one set at the beginning of the green mustache or curly braces, and then we have first name, David, last name, n8n, and it's separated by a comma. I want you to think of a row in a database with 2 columns. One column is first name, the second column is last name. The value for each, obviously, is David, and n8n for the other one, okay? So that's fairly straightforward there. That is it for this section. We'll do one more piece. I kept saying that JSON was the next one. No, we're going to show you one quick advanced area for the functions, and then we're going to move into JSON. We'll see you in the next video. Hey everybody, welcome back, and now we're going to get into looping and iteration, slightly more complicated, but absolutely essential to what it is that you'll be doing here in a lot of stuff with н8н, because I use this quite frequently in a lot of things that we're doing. So to get started, let's talk about looping and iterations, and as such, looping and iteration is essentially just an operation that you do in n8н that allows you to loop over a list of data. I want you to think of a spreadsheet. I want you to think of a bunch of rows in that spreadsheet, and for each of those rows, you're going to do something very specific to it, okay? And so it's commonly used to search for a pattern or condition. And then you'll investigate the existence of something within that list. You'll perform a function. So let me give you a use case example so this makes a little bit more sense. Imagine you're in a CRM system and you say, I want to look over all of my contacts that are past customers where maybe they've made a purchase and where they have maybe made a purchase, say more than a year ago, because maybe you want to rekindle some of those relationships. So that's the search for pattern or condition that I just gave you. And then investigate the existence of something, which is something I also gave you where they haven't purchased in over a year. And then what you want to do is perform a function, which is email and reach back out to them, maybe offer them a 20% discount if they come back, or I don't know, something to incentivize them to buy or rekindle the relationship that may have gone stagnant. So think of looping and iteration when you say to yourself, for each item in the list, I need to do something while there is an item in that list, and I need to do something certain number of times. So let's give an example. This is a little bit even more, or rather a little more simple. And so we have Bob Jones as the first name, and I don't know, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows in this database. So the loop in this example will go 5 times and then exit out to the back end. So in this example, for each of the rows, we're going to split the full name at the space, and then we're going to separate the names nicely into first name and second name. Now, this is clean data. This won't be a problem in the real world. Honestly, nothing's ever this simple. And so as a result of that, we're going to split on the space, and anything to the left is the first name and anything to the right is the last name. And then as we're going through each of the rows, we're going to write the value of that split to the left and to the right accordingly into the column for first name and last name for each of the rows. Okay, so that's the way to understand how this is happening. It's not happening all at once. It's happening one by one by one. Now, that brings up a good point, and I need to specify this, especially if, God forbid, you have 1,000,000 rows of data and you're having to loop through 1,000,000 rows of data. It's going to take a long time. So certain use cases, looping and iterations are not that performant, and there may or may not be other better ways of handling the operation. So just be fully cognizant that looping and iterations, while great, they are one by one by one, and they do take a long time for very large lists. Okay, so each loop in your pass, you can do the functions, and so we already talked about this, about splitting this up, so nothing new to see here. In the next video, we're going to get into some of the conditional understandings, so think of if this, then do something like that, and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, folks, here we're going to get into some very basic functions, okay? So we're not going to go heavy into this at all because this, excuse me, this does get a little bit of geeky, or this does get a little bit geeky, and then you're going to be potentially really, really confused. So we're going to keep this at a very, very high level. Why is this important? Because н8н uses functions as well in the expressions. And as we get into there, you need to have at least a modicum or a little bit of understanding of what is going on here. Okay, so functions essentially perform a single task or operation in code. And functions have a name, and then they're usually followed by a set of parentheses. And the name should, doesn't always, the name should indicate what the function's purpose is and what it's doing. So for example, this is say hello, open, close parentheses. And so when you execute this function in code, it should say hello. I mean, that's what the name says, right? Or at least that's one would think. And so this is good naming convention of your functions. And so there's what we would expect this function to produce if we were to run it. Okay, so functions usually do, but do not always return some value. And the reason for that is that functions could do something, but they don't necessarily have to return something. So think of it like an automation. An automation that has a workflow that doesn't email you to let you know that it's completed. It just runs and that's it. You just assume that it works. So unless you look in the logs and there's no errors, you just assume everything's fine. And so this is pretty much the case with some functions. We just assume the function to function. And as a result of that, we don't necessarily need to have a return value that we capture and display or do something with it. But in other cases, they do. So here is some other ways of thinking about functions in a basic way. You can optionally pass along values to the function. And so if we use that last example of hello, we might be able to pass in, and I'll use my name as an example, David, into it. And the function could be made to use some additional information and return that hello message to me personally, making it very personalized. So if we go say hello, and then in quotes, remember strings as data types we're building, and David is in quotes, and it's in the function curly, or not curly, the function bracket, dear Lord, function parentheses, then what happens is that we wind up getting the name David along with the rest of the function. So it says, hello, David, like that. Now, there's a bunch more that's going on inside the scenes. Like I said, I'm trying to keep this very basic. We're not getting too gnarly into it, but we do want to just give you a basic understanding, okay? So again, the passing in of one or more, my example above only showed one. This is called a parameter, passing a parameter into a function. And in N8N, when you run certain functions, sometimes they need parameters, sometimes they don't. And so that's why this is important in this section, or as it relates to N8N. In the next section, we're going to talk about looping and iteration. So we will see you in the next video. I wanted to give a little breathing room between the functions basic and this functions advanced because I didn't want to scare everybody off early on. But I wanted to provide a visual for the example that I gave to some extent. This is a very quick video, so let me just get into it. When I talked about functions and using a proper name, here's an example, get full name with initial, okay? And I have first name and last name, my name, David Soden. And then what you need to do is you would do something like const, and you'd add middle initial T. Now this isn't formatted correctly, but I just wanted to kind of show you what this might be here. And so here you have the actual kind of JavaScript looking function. And so it's going to ingest the middle T in between the first name and last name, which is my initial here. And so you can see kind of the color, even if you don't understand the syntax, you can see the colors of what that might look like. And again, this is important only because there are functions inside of the expressions of N8N where you are going to have to provide these parameters. And I just wanted you to get used to seeing a couple of different things. Now, this function is called get full name with initial. Now, this is going into traditional programming. Don't worry about it. I said if this function were part of a parent class, just think that a class is just a blueprint or a template for a car. So when Ford Motor Company makes the F-150 truck, they have a blueprint. Like they have parts, they're all made the same, right? But all trucks come out a little bit different. They have different colors, different interiors, blah, 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 blah. And so think of the blueprint to make the truck, even without the colors that makes them different, as the class. It's just an instruction that says, hey, here's what it might do. Now, when you go to paint that truck, that might be a particular function underneath the blueprint, make a Ford F-150 class or template. Okay, and so if we look at this in the context of what I'm trying to do here, if the blueprint is person or class, and you use this thing called dot notation, dot, and then you do the function name, and we pass in the parameters David-Soden, the function itself, again, if you look at the first bullet, I kind of gave a little bit of code that's not formatted, but what happens here, this is the type of syntax that you're going to use in N8N, and you'll need to know that there's a $sign, and we'll get into all of this when we get into expressions. It might look a little scary now because we're working out of a PowerPoint, and there's not a whole lot of context, but when you see this happening in N8N, it's a lot easier. I just wanted to give you a little prep about what this might look like, and there's this thing called IntelliSense. It helps you type, and you don't have to do a lot of the coding. It will almost write it for you, but you just need to understand, hey, I need to add a period. I need to get a shovel and dig in deeper. And so that's what it is. Your person dot, there's your shovel. You dig in deeper, you get into this option, which it will be suggested for you in N8N. Anyway, you pass in David Soden, and then what you get is this output of whatever you put in, and then the static T dot in the middle of that. All right, so that's it for this one. We'll see you in the next video. We're going to dig into JSON. Okay, everybody, a quick and easy video for you. This is persistent and non-persistent data, and it's really easy to understand. So let's look at what persistent versus non-persistent data is. Persistent data is something that is written to a disk or to a hard drive, to a database. The point is it is stored in computer memory, long-term storage. You can shut the computer off and it will stay put. Whereas the inverse of that, non-persistent, they call this temporary storage. This is storage that is tied to something in memory. So in the event that you turn off the power, your laptop runs out of battery, your phone runs out of battery, and you're in the middle of writing an email and it doesn't save off a draft, it's gone, okay? It is done. You'll also hear it referred to as ephemeral. If you ever run across that word, just know that the plain English translation to that is temporary storage. And you'll see this a lot in coding, programming, some cloud storages. Specifically, Amazon uses the word quite a bit. But in any event, just a quick video to tell you what this persistent versus non-persistent data storage is, so that if you run across it, you at least have some understanding of what this is all about. The star of the show is JSON, because a lot of everything you're going to do inside of N8N, you're going to see JSON repeated time and time again. And while N8N makes a super use case and simple use of how to use and manipulate JSON, it also is laid out in such a way to where you don't have to think too heavily. In some cases you will, but for the most part, as you're getting started and you're playing and understanding it, you're going to see how super easy this is. But you're going to need to have this understanding going in, so make sure you pay attention. Okay, now JSON, aka the star of the show. To understand JSON, it's so simple. Just think of a spreadsheet. I've used this example or association to illustrate this, and it really does help to understand this otherwise hard to grasp concept for most folks that are not programmers. So spreadsheets, they have tables. And the tables have columns and rows. You've heard me say this before. This is nothing new. The rows are called records. So at this point, this should just be a refresher because we've been building up to this point. Columns are the fields in the record. And if we look at a spreadsheet, you can see that the red table, I've got arrows pointing to what the table name is. This is a Google Sheet formatted as a table. You can see the rows in purple. I've used row number 2, even though it's customer ID 1. And so you can see all of this information here. So if you're pretty analytical thinking and you're learning and maybe you're not a programmer, I want to help get you unstuck because I myself would go to this part in a course and think, and they're trying to understand that array, that zero-based array example I gave you. Do not try to associate that understanding here in this context because you may notice that this is in the spreadsheet, it's row number 2 and it says customer ID 1. And remember I told you there was a shift of everything's off by 1. Don't throw that understanding. That's not applicable here, okay? So if that's how your mind was thinking, don't go there. That's not applicable here. Go back to the context of that video. It is germane there, but yes, it is shifted by 1, but there is no association there. So I just wanted to head that off at the path in case somebody's mind went there. Okay, so that being said, this is essentially JSON and the structure, okay? We've got tables, columns, and rows. Now, how does this look syntax? Now, if you look at brackets, these open and closed brackets that are usually shifted just to the right of the P and to the left of the backslash or pipe symbol on the keyboard, or most US keyboards anyway. If you're some other part of the world, I'm not sure how that keyboard layout is, so I do apologize. But in any event, find the brackets on your keyboard, and anything inside of the brackets should be one or more rows or records, okay? Now, a row or a record is symbolized, and we saw this earlier when we talked about dictionaries. Anything inside of these mustache braces or curly braces, this is what it means to be a row or a record. Now, to see columns and the values, this is where we get into this key value type of nomenclature or syntax. Again, the key is the name of the column, and then the value is what you see in a cell within a spreadsheet. So if we look back at that spreadsheet in Google Sheet example, the word dough is the value. The key is last name. And if we just had key value of last name, dough inside of the brackets, that's all that would be. But we would also have comma and key values for customer ID, a key value, comma, key value for first name, comma, key value for last name, comma, key value for email. And then inside of all of that, sorry about that, inside of all of that, you will have a set of the mustache braces, which would indicate that record or row. Now, you optionally would have the brackets if it wanted to be, or if it was supposed to be anything other than a record. And this is where this is important. When you are looking at the raw JSON code, anytime you do see that those the square brackets, know that you're dealing with an array or a list, and this is where that index comes in, that 0, that 1, that whatever. Now, н8н will help you with a user interface that allows you to select the first record, so dealing with having to use zero-based indexing with these arrays, or the second row, which is index 1. When you get to those, you don't have to deal with that unless you're writing an expression and you explicitly find yourself in a use case where this is applicable and this needs to be done for whatever reason. But by and large, the user interface in н8н is going to help you greatly dealing with all of this. All right, so here we are with the curly braces, and we've got first name, David. We've seen this a million times already. Last name, н8н, address. Now, I want to show you a lot of combinations therein of how this could be applied, right? Up until this point, we have been very simple. We don't have any square brackets. All we have is the curly brace or mustache braces. So we're dealing with a single row right now, or a record. We're not dealing with a spreadsheet. We're not dealing with a table. But something interesting just popped up when I did this right here, okay? Notice that instead of the value, all of a sudden a magical curly brace showed up again. So what this means is within the value for a particular key, you don't have to just do your typical data types, which is your integers, your strings, your floats. You can also have additional lists. You can have additional records. And in this case, this is a record. We've got an address with multiple key values inside of this address value. So the value for address is all of this entire record. Now, for those of you that do have a modicum or a little bit of technical knowledge, or may come from a database background where you're dealing with relational database management systems, you might have contact table, and then you might have a addresses table. And so this is two separate tables bringing information together. There's no relationship here per se, but I just wanted to let you know that that is maybe one way of thinking about it, where you have a nested table as the value for address. And so it looks like this. Okay. Now we're going to move on to something that might else blow your mind. And for children, we have a list of children's names: Yoda, Chewie, Jaja, poor children. In any event, this is what a array or list looks like as a value inside this one record for David н8н, and it has all of its information and metadata about the address and the children, and of course all all of that gets closed up with the record. And so I wanted to illustrate to you that values are not always straight data types, as you may have seen or thought of before. You do have the opportunity to go through each one of these. It might start off as a nice clean record where you have a column first name, a column last name, and then you got this address column, but then the value doesn't fit nicely in a cell. You can put this into Excel like this. It's not advisable, but in JSON, it's really, really easy to do. Let me give you an example of this. If we were to do if this were to come back in an API and we would get this information back, if I wanted to get the city, in N8N, I simply use my mouse cursor, I highlight city, and I drag it into the expression field. N8N will write all of the code for me. I don't have to mess with it or deal with it. Oh my God, it's so easy. So that being said, even though this might be freaking you out right now, it is programmatically fairly straightforward to get. So whatever the API response is, you'd take that, then you'd go to address.city. And so it's just going down, connecting what's connected to whatever. The parent is the curly brace. So the first one in the list is address, and the second layer of that, you just need to get the city, because ultimately you're trying to get to the value some city. But again, N8N is a drag and drop operation. You'll see it. Now, when you get into expressions, you may need to code into these dots, and we'll show you all of this as we dig much deeper into this. So thank you very much. If you need to reach out to me, you can find me at davidsoden.com. You can, there's I think a request form or something out there. In any event, now we're going to get into the N8N part of the course, where we're going to dig into just about anything and everything that we can with regards to the nodes, but we're going to set you up with a little bit of preparatory information before we get into that with regards to N8N on how or what you can do with it. So we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.